want to thank you for coming. I know I can safely quote Steven Zipperstein, who said to me that this is an extraordinary audience. And it's a tribute to our movement and to the people who have come. So we, the members of the Colloquium, are going to applaud you. Shall we do that? And now we want to hear from you. So the way to be, there is a wandering, is Bill here with a wandering microphone? Good. Raise your hand and be recognized, and then Les, and wait for the microphone, all right? Just stand up so he can give you the microphone. All right, great.
I don't think I need it.
All right, fine.
I just want to make a comment.
You got to use the microphone.
Well, first of all, I want to thank the members of this colloquium for giving us all a great intellectual and entertaining experience. And the people who helped put it together from the temple and elsewhere. Actually, I just want to make a comment for what it's worth.
Keep the microphone up.
For what it's worth, because I realize that the intellect at that side of the table is far greater than mine. But when Yehuda said, what are the causes of anti-Semitism? Who knows? And more or less, you know, as to what it is and what it's going to be. I submit respectfully and humbly that if you're a minority, if you are intellectual, articulate, and successful, and if you have a high profile, knowing that we're in a world that is so imperfect, where there is jealousy and greed, and where there is always a look to scapegoat, Jews will be a group, whether for ethnic reasons, cultural reasons, theological reasons, that will be one of the first to receive a racist, negative aspect, and in that way it'll be anti-Semitic. And one of the reasons why I am so proud and happy to be a humanistic Jew is because I think one of the things that this organization presents is a way to diffuse that a little bit. Because one of the aggravating aspects of traditional Judaism is this thing of exclusivity. Humanistic Judaism doesn't do that. Humanistic Judaism invites you to take part of our group based upon your feeling of our culture and our history. And for those reasons, I think it'll help diminish, if certainly not do away with, anti-Semitism to some extent. Thank you.
All right, Hans, and then pass the microphone down there, and then we'll come back front. All right.
Thank you. Yehuda Bauer said something about anti-Semitism spreading throughout the world through some kind of cultural means. I don't know if I quote you exactly, but it had to do with culture. I don't have a reputation to protect, and from this excellent vantage point of ignorance, I will categorically state that a human psyche is much more universal than any culture, and that ideas, as they now spread so quickly throughout the world, reaches many psyches, and in spite of differences in cultures, they take hold. And if for instance, the Christian church or the Christianity would disappear tomorrow, there would be many more instigators that would instigate anti-Semitism because the psyches are there and the information system is in place. Thank you.
Did you want, Yehuda, would you like to respond to that?
Well, maybe there are more questions like that, but you see, there is a contradiction when you say we are being set aside for persecution because of our prominence and our intelligence and so on and so forth, and then you say that we have to take part in the general society, which of course means that we will be prominent and intellectual and so on and so forth. And the historically anti-Semitism took place in both kinds of societies. Polish Jews were neither rich nor, as far as the Polish society was concerned, they were not intellectuals in the Polish society. On the other hand, when there was an exclusivity in Jewish life, the Jews were attacked, and when they opened up to the general society, they were attacked. The examples, of course, are Spain and Germany. So in both, so you can't explain, you see, a phenomenon that appears in all these cultures by one certain aspect which may have increased slightly or decreased slightly the prevalence of this social pathology. So I don't think that that can be an explanation. And when the other questioner said the psyche, well, the psyche doesn't necessarily react against Jews. The psyche reacts against all kinds of things. And there were psyches all over the place, and I mentioned some of them, that did not react against the Jews, although the Jews were there. So again, this is no answer. You have to examine the psychology of the people with which you are dealing. And I think that one of the, we discussed Japan here. You see, one of the things that happen when Western civilization spreads, I don't know whether it's a civilization, but anyway, when these ideas or this kind of technological society spreads, it exports laundry machines and films and computers and clothing and so on and so forth, and ideas. Amongst these ideas certainly is, and I think you're right there, is anti-Semitism. It's part of the baggage. And I think that one has to realize that there is an import of anti-Semitism in the third world which cannot be discounted, which is there. The countermeasures must be the same for the whole world. Of course, I mean, there's considerably less anti-Semitism in Ghana than there is in Holland, yes, for obvious historical reasons. I believe that when we discuss this phenomenon, we have to get rid of preconceived ideas of our own. That whether if we open up, it'll be all right, or on the contrary, if we close down, it'll be all right. That people are envious of us. But nobody was envious of poor Jewish peddlers in Poland. These are additions, these are the results of anti-Semitism, these are symptoms, these are not the underlying causes. And the underlying cause I tried to point out, perhaps I didn't use the actual term, is the difference between the culture of the Jews originally as it was and the surroundings, and then a snowballing effect over time. And when you say that if all the churches disappear, there'll still be anti-Semitism, I'm not so sure. Not because people believe in Jesus, but because the continued impact of Christianity and Islam has been in the direction of preserving anti-Jewish preconceived notions. If these notions are weakened by, for instance, what we see now happening in parts of the Christian world, then I think that it's like undercutting the roots of a tree. And it may, I can't promise that, but it could well mean that one of the original sources of anti-Semitism is thereby weakened. And that therefore there may be... Now, when you look at this country, it's very difficult to measure latent anti-Semitism. But some people have tried. And they're telling me that figures they collected for 1964 on the one hand, this is Glick and his group, and the late 80s on the other hand, show a diminution of latent anti-Semitism from 29%, bidyuk, 29% of the population to 20%. Whatever the figures, there seems to be a decline. But as I said, there's still every fifth person in the United States is unconsciously usually spouting forth anti-Jewish notions, or on the side, or inadvertently, and so on and so forth. So it's there, but it's weakening. And I think you can follow the same trend in other countries. In Europe, the country with the highest quotient of latent anti-Semitism is Austria. and then very closely followed by places like Romania and so on. The traditional source of anti-Semitism in Europe, Germany, Poland, France, there it's going down. So we have to adjust our thinking to the realities and not remain in preconceived notions. I always say, you know, it's like the soldier who thinks that because the mortar bomb hit one place and there's a crater there, it'll hit there again. Not necessarily. It can hit elsewhere, and that crater may remain empty.
Sherwin, could I just add one thing? I was just to do a very brief rhetorical analysis of Yehuda's comment, because I actually found it very moving. It was, look, for Yehuda Bauer to say that he does not know about the origins of anti-Semitism is obviously on one level a rhetorical remark, and it cannot be taken at face value because who knows more? But I saw it, and I say this not because Yehuda's in the room, but I was deeply moved, and I think it's a model of intellectual integrity. In other words, it demonstrates how knowledge, at least at best, actually adds to one's wisdom. That well beyond one's youth, let's say, one allows added knowledge to unsettle oneself. And I think that Yehuda's comment in this respect is a model. And I certainly hope and pray that I'll be able to make comments like that in public when, in 10 years when I'm as old as Yehuda.
I'd like to...
You know, youth is a sickness that passes with time.
I'd like to point out, since ever, that the only method for the discovery of truth, which allows you to change your mind on the basis of new evidence, basically that's what reason is. Reason is the ability to respond always to the evidence and to be strong enough and courageous enough on the face of new evidence to change your mind. And that, to me, is the power both of reason and the power of science, because once we're into always discovering the eternal verities, then we never are able to change. And it's very important to always be able to do what Yehuda does. And I also speak with great admiration for Yehuda, because to say, after all that time, maybe I was wrong, is a very great strength. And by the way, one of the skills that I think we as secular humanistic Jews need to have is the courage to admit that we're wrong, and the courage also to always respond to the experience of new evidence. I hope your coming to this colloquium will also influence you in changing your ideas and your minds about things. Well, there's a question. Yes, right over there in the middle. That gentleman had his hand up. Well, all right.
Oh no, Jim did.
You grabbed the mic.
Just like Norman Cantor here.
One of the ways to speak here is to grab the microphone. Okay, fine.
Right. Just questions and comments and question. One question. The comment, of course, is I think is an excellent colloquium and a wonderful weekend. In fact, in my mind, that the scholars we have here, I think, are even more diverse than the ones we had 2 years ago. Yes, some agreed with each other, some didn't, maybe perhaps with more zeal than tact. But food was excellent and plentiful. The toilets were few. As a student of the Institute, I would certainly wish that the Institute would recruit their new scholars to help teach in our movement. My question, really directed at Professor Prinzler, that I have my own answer, which you may alter, may change my opinion, but for this colloquium, we have learned that there are old myths and there are recent myths. And your comments about Zionism are interesting in the fact that there are things that I learned as a young person that you were saying are not true, that what I was taught. Now, what's interesting about that is that considering that these recent myths in the short period of time, we're talking about things that are in just the last 50 years. The question is, why are these false ideas being, Why did we hear these false ideas before? And that's my question.
Oops, hold on. There we go. Well, the myths aren't necessarily quite as young as that. I mean, a lot of the basic, the Zionist critique of the diaspora, the Zionist critique of Eastern European Jewish culture, of Western Jewry, this is a century old. And so some of the basic building blocks of the way people think about, or the way Zionists have thought about their history have been in place for a century. And then, again, some of the basic building blocks of the way, for example, that Zionists thought about the Palestinian Arabs, the way they justified their policies of the use of force and so forth. These are developed in the 1920s. So we're not talking about recent myths. As far as 1948 goes, every country has its myths of its formative wars, and those myths are created during the struggle itself, and they're immediately propagated. That's true for all countries, and when you realize that the people who wrote the first histories, let's say, of Israel's wars were people who had participated in the wars, they were officers in the Israeli army, then of course those myths are going to be propagated and propagated very quickly.
Right. Do you have the microphone? That means you speak.
Yes, as I do. I have two questions. One for Derek Pensler. One. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. One to Derek Pensler and one to Yehuda Bauer. With respect to Derek Pensler, you gave various arguments that the postmodernists were giving, and after discussing them, said they were that this was a polemical group, and then you went to the issue of what you call neo-Zionists. Some of these arguments, such as that the Jewish settlers who insisted on farming their own land took work away from the Arab settlers, and that Zionism was regarded as imperialism and stopping the nationalism of the Arabs, are old not just in the sense of communists, but by scholars, such as for instance, they're in Walter Lacour's book of the history of Zionism. So I wonder whether I hope you didn't mean to say that all these arguments are just polemical. There's a valid argument with respect to them.
Do you want him to respond to that question? Let him respond first.
Okay.
No, as I tried to say, and I hope I didn't miscommunicate. No, of course there is much truth in these criticisms, but the way the criticisms are offered, the vociferousness, the one-sidedness, the inability to contextualize, this is worrisome. What worries me more than anything is what I call, and this is typical in Israeli academia, the cult of the document. As if let's say now the 1967 war, archives from the 1967 war are going to come open. And I'm sure that Israel is going to be full of scholars poking through these archives. Just because you find new documents doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get the final answer. As Tony Judd, a very brilliant European historian, has recently written in the New York Review of Books, if this were the case, then we'd have no new books on the French Revolution, because the documents were in place a long time ago. I mean, the fact is that what these scholars are bringing into their scholarship is often an agenda. Now, I believe it was Croce, I'm not sure, who said that it's fine if people bring into their scholarship an agenda because they ask questions that people before haven't asked, and therefore they come closer to approximating truth, let's say, than people had before. There is validity. Let's say Benny Morris's argument about the origins of the Palestine refugee problem, or Ken Stein's discussion of the way that the Jews bought their land from Palestinian peasants. It's true. Much of it is true. Undeniably true. But there are also limitations, problems, and so forth. And what bothers me is their own inability to recognize their own weaknesses.
Right. You have a second question?
Yes.
Briefly, thank you.
Yes, it's very brief. In Netanyahu's book on Spanish Inquisition, he has a section talking about the origin of Zionism, pre-Christian anti-Semitism, which one of the reasons he gives is Jewish soldiers in Egypt helping the Greeks, and then when the Greeks came in, and then helping the Romans when the Romans came in. Do you have any thoughts about that?
I very much value the older Netanyahu's scholarship on Spain. I think it's a very important book. But I don't think that he really has much more knowledge than I have about pre-Christian Egypt. And I feel that these are theories which lack real proof. It may well be that there were several contributory factors, you see, to the riots in Alexandria against the Jews. It seems quite clear that the main factor there was a question of equal rights and of economic advantages and of a fear by the Hellenistic population that the Jews would multiply and take over, because it seems that quite a number of people joined the Jewish community and so on. Again, you see, when you deal with these rather remote, from our point of view now, remote events, I quite agree with Derek Penslar's comment that you can't rely just on documents, but they help. And when you don't have the documents, it's very difficult. So, you know, if I may, just very briefly, my teacher at Hebrew University invited me to his study once, and I asked him, what evidence do you have, or how many books articles were written on Jews in Poland before the 13th century? And he said, oh, look, there's a whole shelf I have here of books, articles, brochures, and so on and so forth. I said, but there's practically no evidence. He says, that's the reason. When there's no evidence, you can write any kind of books.
By the way, that's called religion. No. All right. We will. Ruth had her hand up. Okay, fine.
I had the mic here.
Oh, right. Stand up. Good.
Can I ask her?
Yes, sure. You have the microphone. That's power. Power. Yeah, I know. I'm going to now arrange to be equitable. Okay, fine.
I have two questions I'd like to ask as one. First of all, we believe, if anyone, I don't know. We believe that many of the events and the people of the Bible never really happened. They are myths, they are fictitious, it didn't happen. And I would like to know, at what point in time do we start believing that it is no longer myth, but that it is actual history that actually happened? And my second question is that when I debate with traditionalists and I try to tell them that the Torah was not written by God, it was written by man, and many of the people and the events never happened, and I think they come up with a valid question, which I still don't have a good answer for, is, who are all these people who would make up these people and events that never happened, and why would they want to con us and our ancestors into believing all of these things? What would be their motivation behind this? What are their reasons?
Did you answer that? Thank you.
I've grown unused to public speaking. Those are...
No, Morris, he hasn't answered the question.
Oh, do you want to answer the question?
And I haven't given you the microphone yet. All right, thank you. Well, he shouldn't have. All right, give it back, and we're going to go around the balconies. Thank you.
Those are both excellent questions to which there's no clear answer. And the point at which history begins is continually being pushed closer to our time, but probably hasn't pushed too far. A generation ago, it might have been said that the history begins with the period of the Judges in the book of Judges. Some might have said with the rise of the monarchy with Samuel and Saul. Some people might have said King David because look at the verisimilitude, the realness of the stories about the goings on in his court, the human realness, the political realness. Then people said, but how could we really know what was going on in Absalom's and Amnon's bedroom anyway? I mean, it's too real. And actually, I agree with that. It's too real. It's fiction. All I can say is, to date, history would begin around the year 800 or so. 9th century, with the rise of Assyrian power. The first Israelite, I believe, this may be wrong, I believe it's right, the first Israelite mentioned in non-biblical materials is King Ahab. Achav, and several other, a half dozen or so monarchs from the Bible thereafter crop up in Mesopotamian annals. But that could change tomorrow. David became, his stock rose a little bit, since we now think if he was a fiction, at least people believed in him within 150 years of when he supposedly died. Your other question was, oh, why would they make it up? No, that's what I constantly ask the minimalists that Charles Kramelkov referred to. It's been shown that they did not write history in our sense in antiquity. But the model that's proposed to replace that is that they wrote fantasy like J.R.R. Tolkien or something, where they add a lot of details to make it sound real. And it is kind of funny that many of these details have been corroborated, but there are people who say that everything is false until it's proven true. Such people, when they live in the normal world, I call paranoiacs, but they call themselves critical historians.
Sherwin,
now we're going to move it around.
Sherwin, just before, obviously, it's crucial to try to be as accurate as possible. But when you ask for descriptions of things as they actually happened, just step back from the comment for a moment. If three of us were to have the physical and mental energy at 2 o'clock this afternoon to sit down and describe what actually happened over the last 3 days, our descriptions would likely be very different. All of us would be striving toward accuracy. All of us presumably are honest people, and our descriptions would vary. And so I would, in a sense, employ some skepticism in what appears to be your quite honest quest for accuracy and rationality in life.
Steve, may I add a myth that exemplifies that?
Please.
Tell a myth. There's a story that may or may not be true, but is true in the deepest sense, that Mark Bloch tells at the beginning of his little work on the historian's craft that you mentioned, one of my favorite books, perhaps one of yours, that when Sir Walter Raleigh was locked up in the Tower of London, he beheld a fight in the street down below. Later on, he heard accounts of participants of what had happened in that fight, and then he resolved to burn all his history books.
Well, I'm hoping that in 100 years, this Colloquium of Detroit will be viewed as having been divinely inspired. No. Anyway, Morris, Ruth she has the microphone now, and she had her hand up first.
And I had the blessing.
Okay, thank you.
I think one of the unique things about this colloquium, unless my memory is already becoming inaccurate, which is quite possible, is that I think this is one of the few Jewish events or assemblages of this type where I don't think I've yet heard the word intermarriage. So
How did we slip up?
So I'm going to bring it up and ask Yehuda to what extent you think intermarriage might possibly be a factor in this decline in anti-Semitism recently, or to what extent you think it might affect the picture in any way.
Could make it much worse.
Again,
We're Jewish in-laws.
I find it hard to believe that intermarriage as such would make a tremendous amount of difference. In the case of Spain, for instance, conversion and intermarriage did not seem to reduce the enthusiasm for anti-Jewishness by the Catholic Church in Spain or by the civic authorities as well. The same applies to Germany, where there was a lot of intermarriage. But I do think that intermarriage, if properly handled, which it isn't, might well change the Jewish community to such an extent that it might stand up much better against the threats of anti-Semitism, because you cannot fight a Jewish... there is no evidence of any success of any Jewish organization fighting anti-Semitism unless the society around the Jews were willing to accept anti-Semitic messages. So any kind of Jewish reaction against anti-Semitism is dependent on the host society. The host society may be influenced, if the Jews handle it correctly, if intermarriage increases, as it will, and if non-Jews who want to join the Jewish communities will be received in the kind of way that many of us believe should be done.
By the way, Morris, it's your turn, Morris. Give Morris the microphone, please.
Here's a mic here, please. There is a mic.
He's stolen my mic.
Well, not that.
I have a mic.
You have to wait your turn. Morris has the microphone. You're next.
It's all right. I have this.
You're next, and use
I've
that
been
microphone.
waiting 2 years to get up and ask my question. Because 2 years ago, when I attended this colloquium, I sat in my seat and I plotzed because the discussion was so stimulating and I was so concerned and I wanted to express my opinion. So finally,
You have a question?
I have yes.
He's got 2 years.
And I want to ask 3 questions.
All right, ask.
3 different speakers.
All right, fine.
For 2 years. First, Professor Bauer.
Put the microphone near your mouth.
All right.
Morris.
First, Professor Bauer. Anti-Semitism as a cause of the Holocaust, it's not a very important question because we know that if you choose to be a minority, you got to be prepared to take your knocks. So anti-Semitism leads to all kinds of things. A more significant question is, how come the Jewish people survived through these thousands of years? And if you can later on a brief response to this
All right,
is
that's the question.
That's the first. I'm not
We'll answer one question at a time. Yehuda?
Well, but I want to ask my other question.
There are lots of other people.
There are lots of other people that want to ask questions more. Yehuda? All right.
I disagree with your first comment. I think that it's very important to say that anti-Semitism was the major cause for the Holocaust, because there are people who say the opposite. And of course, anti-Semitism existed in large numbers of societies at a very long period of time, didn't cause the Holocaust. So the question is, why did this particular anti-Semitism develop, and how did it concern the Holocaust? But your question is, I think, a very good one, an excellent one. The Jewish people survived because they were a minority, dispersed in different places. Had they been concentrated in one place, it would have been much more difficult. Now, the difference in civilization, culture, snowballing into a separate kind of defensive group, building walls around it, in situations that were not open societies, was conducive to survival of this group. When they were threatened in one place, they moved to another place. When they were discarded in one place, they were welcomed in another. And the peculiar civilization, developing civilization, not a constant one, but a developing one that they brought with them, made it possible for them to survive internally. In other words, to find interest and continuity in what they were doing. Nevertheless, the majority of the Jewish people did not survive, because the majority of the Jewish people either assimilated with others or converted, and so on and so forth. So there is only a core that survived. This is much more difficult today. In open societies, where you have the choice of being either separate or not, it's a new situation to which the Jewish people have not yet or not become accustomed or adjusted to. And whether they will or not is still an open question. I think it's very important to note that the fact that a pluralistic society in principle accepts the right not only of individuals to be different, but of groups to be different, encourages or would or could encourage a Jewish community that is both separate and yet united with the surroundings in which it lives. So there is a possibility like that. But there are also attractions for individuals in the Jewish community not to be Jewish, and things that people reject within the culture that we call the Jewish civilization and culture, which moves them outside. And these are open questions which we have discussed umpteen times, so I don't want to go into them.
All right. Question, yes.
Thank you. I understand, Derek Penslar, that you noted that a reason for the creation of the State of Israel was imperialism. Please comment.
Thank you.
Short question. I'll try to make a short answer. The era of imperialism of the late 19th and early 20th century is an era where European power is projected onto much of the globe, including the Middle East. The Zionist movement could only have gotten a toehold in Palestine with the support of one or more great powers. The British, after all, created a situation in Palestine which encouraged, as I said during my talk, Jewish immigration, so that a community of some 60,000 in 1918 was a community of some 600,000 by 1948. The British built the infrastructure of the country, not for the Zionists' own benefit, for their own, as imperialists always do. But the British constructed the railroads, the roads, the ports, the harbors, and the like. The British favored Jews more than Arabs in, I'd say, the bureaucracy, the administrative system. The Attorney General of Palestine during much of the period, Norman Bentwich, was himself a Zionist. The British did a great deal then during the 1930s to encourage the development of the Yishuv's military, the militias, so that they would have a native fighting force to fight against the Palestinian Arabs who were in revolt at the time. Finally, it was the British who were largely responsible for the creation during the Second World War of the Palmach, which would go on to become the leading force of the young State of Israel's army. All of these things are the result of the British.
All right. Harold, pass the microphone to Harold Black.
I have it
I'm
right
sorry,
now.
Barbara. I didn't realize.
Every single day.
Harold, after Barbara, then.
Betty.
Betty, I'm sorry.
Every single day I've heard the word minimalist mentioned. I know what it is in art. I know what it is in poetry, but I don't have any concept of what it is.
Do you want to answer?
I'm sorry. I was trading notes with the girl next to me. We're trying to... You asked. I heard the word minimalism and maximalism. Were you asking what they mean?
Minimalism. Historical minimalism.
A couple of scholars. One is a New Testament Qumran scholar named Philip Davies of Sheffield, England, and another protagonist in this is a man named Thomas Thompson, who wrote a marvelous book that was everyone's favorite book when I was in grad school, disproving everything everyone had said about the patriarchs being historical. He turned his marvelous negative critical faculties to everything else in the Bible, and they are called the minimalists because they say that anything in the Bible, I think they would even say this is a fair statement, that anything in the Bible that cannot be proven true is assumed to be false until proven otherwise. And they used to have another name, I forget what they were called, but then they've been called the minimalist, and they in turn have called everyone else maximalists, people who think that whatever is not disproved is assumed to be true, and they've tried to lump them together with fundamentalists, which hasn't really fooled anybody. But any sensible person will not try to write definitively the history of ancient Israel or any other period, even better tested ones, but will present the alternatives and leave doubt so as not to have to retract a hasty statement in the future. Since I missed your question, I don't know if I've answered it.
Betty.
Okay.
All right, great. Harold, thank you.
It's not a Jewish issue, and the Jewish scholars have been in the maximalist camp. Israeli scholars have been archaeologists have been vigorously defending some of the historicity of the Bible to varying degrees.
Harold?
There was a period, is this thing on?
Yeah. Thing is on. You have a question?
There was a period when Judaism and Christianity were, either one was just as likely to succeed and become the religion over great masses of people. Why was it that Christianity won out?
25 words or less.
All right. Why did Christianity win out? Yaakov?
Eric Myers.
I get microphone right. Thank you.
I think because of the power of the myth. What happened in Christianity, and I'm speaking about not the period when Christianity was part of Judaism, because in the beginning it was part of Judaism. It was just one of the Hasidic groups that survived in Judaism with its own Rebbe, who served only Jews, and he spoke only to Jews, and he also propagated the keeping of the halakha as they understood it then. And it was a part of Jewish religion. It wasn't a different religion, therefore there was no competition between them. And their synagogue was in Jerusalem, and everything was quite idyllic. Like it is with Hasidim today, I mean, in these terms. Then, when Paul started to separate, or actually to try to bring Christianity to non-Jews, he or other geniuses after him combined the myths of the Middle East with the God dying and surviving, with the mother goddess, with the father, mother, and son, myths that were prevalent in the Middle East for thousands of years. And they incorporated these myths into one coherent myth, and the myth won, not the religion. With this myth, you could really conquer the world. And since they addressed themselves mainly to what is called Yir'ei Adonai, the fearers of Yahweh, these were half-Jews. They were people who recognized monotheism in principle, but they were not keeping mitzvot. And they had difficulty with circumcision and with other mitzvot that they had to take if they would really convert. Paul gave them a way out. And he offered them a wonderful way of monotheism, which includes also myths, pagan myths, something very similar to what is happening in Mexico, actually. And this, together with the liberation from mitzvot, and with the feeling that if you believe in this myth, you actually fulfill your duty and your soul is saved. And because this was also a very particular kind of messianism, it was a messianism directed to the individual, not like the Jewish messianism that is directed to a national collective. Those were so attractive that they really spread very fast. And since, as we heard, and I believe more what Yuda said than what others, that Salo Baron was right, and there were millions of Yir'ei Adonai and Jews all over the empire, for them it was very easy to adopt this new religion with its new myths, and with its new freedom, and with its new messianism, and with its new mysticism, instead of Judaism, which was still a very pluralistic, but at the same time a very demanding halachic religion.
What I'd like to do now is, because of the time, is to say that if you have questions, maybe some of our panel members will remain afterwards, but I would like to conclude by inviting each of our panel members to share with us their feeling of their experience during the weekend. I mean, Yehuda, would you begin?
I enjoyed it.
Great.
I think it was a very warm feeling here, wonderful organization and tremendous outpouring of goodwill and friendliness, and the same with the panelists, with the obvious exception, and and I thought
Yehuda's always criticizing me.
And I think it was the only time, not only as Ruth said, but in the secular humanistic movement, but I don't remember anywhere in the Jewish world having participated, having heard of a panel that discussed a re-evaluation of Jewish history. And I think this is a first, and I think it's a very useful first. And if it is published properly, it probably will have a tremendous impact. One last observation. You know, I feel that people come to these meetings usually with their prejudices firmly established. And it'll be very hard for them to change their views because they've come with them to start with anyway. In this case, my skepticism is a bit shaken. We may have had some impact, and some impact. You know, we have concepts that are very terribly difficult to get rid of. Well, it sort of struck me, this question about imperialism. If you ask Indians today, what about British imperialism? They say, I wish we had it back. Who says imperialism was a bad thing? I mean, the implication is, well, Zionism was the ally of imperialism, so this is a bad point for Zionism. Is it? I wonder if we had allied itself, as Ben-Gurion suggested at the point, with communist Russia, would that have been any better? I doubt it. So I think that one has to reevaluate, and mind you, I thought the same way a few decades ago. So I think we have to reevaluate as we go along our thinking, and I think this colloquium helped some of us, at least, certainly myself, to do that.
Why don't we express our appreciation for Yehuda's being.
Sherwin? Sherwin? Hang on for a minute, Derek. One has to be, as a humanistic Jew, one has to be flexible. I'm going to ask the presenters if they would be kind enough to jot down their 3 books on a piece of paper for me, and we will post the entire bibliography on our webpage, which is www.shj.org. And that way, we save the stamps and mailing it to you, and you can get it within the next couple of days.
Let's, Marty, I'd like to finish going around the table.
Well,
then we'll discuss the details of the bibliography.
Well,
all right, fine. Derek?
I've really never been in an event like this. I've been teaching for 11 years. I've done a lot of adult education in synagogues and community centers. I've never seen anything like this, where the community is so well educated, so informed, so committed. And I can genuinely say that I've learned from you, and that we have all learned from each other, because even though we're supposed to be the great chochams, the fact is that we do tend, all of us, to over-specialize, and I've learned a great deal from my colleagues. This has been a remarkable experience, and I can honestly say I thank you very much for inviting me to participate.
I have felt privileged to be up here with these wonderful scholars. It's been fantastic for me.
I think I've already expressed my impressions to so many people in the hall on different occasions. I'm feeling as if I'm regurgitating a text that when I first delivered it was much fresher. But for me, it's been a discovery of a territory I knew nothing at all about, and I feel excited and privileged to have had this opportunity. I share with Derek the sense of the extraordinary quality of this group, with its eagerness for knowledge, with its intelligence, with its critical acumen, and my fellow panelists likewise. It was really a privilege to be here, and I'm immensely grateful for the opportunity to find out more about you. Okay.
The reason we do not remember many meetings like that is not that they didn't exist, but it existed a very long time ago. There was a custom in Babylon to have Yarchei Kala, months of the bride. And they were not for the bride, they were for people meeting like we meet now to discuss, to learn together, to have various opinions aired, and to clarify and to change maybe our ideas as they used to do in the period of a culture of dialogue that existed in those days. And I think that we should congratulate the organizers and the initiators of this colloquium, and especially Sherwin Wine, because they are actually renewing a very old Jewish tradition and fulfilling it with a new content. And one more remark. My feeling is that the two things that were lacking in this colloquium, and I hope that they will come up in colloquiums in the future. One, we do not have enough scholars in the Jewish studies world who research the secular culture and the secular community, in spite of the fact that it's the culture of the majority of the Jewish nation. We have a lot of experts on the various minorities, religious and others, that live in our nation, but we do not have enough research and scholarship on our secular culture. And I think time has come to include this very vital subject in our subjects of discussion. And the last remark, I feel that the history of the Jewish people, like the history of all people, includes the cultural creativity as much as the political, the sociological, the anthropological, and the other aspects of it. We don't have enough in our meetings of the history of our art, the history of our literature, the history of our music, the history of our theater, the history of our cinema, which all concern the spirituality and the emotional life of people, and we should include it too in our colloquia.
I don't really like talking about myself in this kind of setting, and this has been a unique gathering in many respects. And the last bit of uniqueness seems to be asking us to reflect so very quickly upon the time we've been together. So I plead that I'm a very slow thinker, and I don't really have anything else to say beyond what others have said already. I have found the discussions interesting, exciting. I love Jewish history. I love talking about it. I love hearing about periods that I don't really know that well. And thank you all very much.
As an ancient historian, I feel I need a period of reflection about 3,000 years, and then I can tell you what I think may have happened here this past weekend. For me, the greatest pleasure has been crossing disciplinary boundaries. Biblical scholars almost never talk to Judaic scholars, and the opposite is too often true. And I felt that several new intellectual and personal friendships have begun this weekend, and I'm very grateful for that.
Maybe one sentence. I thank you all. I learned a great deal. I feel like maybe I'm doing now a first step from my post-secularism stage to neo-secularism. So thank you all about it.
I just want to comment on the extraordinary tenacity of our presenters. They are the embodiment of the term Sitzfleisch, and they are to be congratulated. I think it was wonderful.
This bit of flesh is going to... I can't sit much longer. Look, I think that part of the reason why I would feel so spent, and I admit to you I feel beyond exhausted now, is that it's not merely the number of hours that we've spoken to you and sat here and you've sat. It's also that there's a palpable hunger in this room. It's one feels it. It's moving, and perhaps what all I could wish for you is that first, that the stupid, silly barriers that have separated wonderful, good Jews like yourself and that have been set up by others
separating your full participation in Jewish life would simply be demolished. And clearly Rabbi Wine's good work in getting validation from the Federation is a step toward that goal. And that perhaps once these barriers prove to be less stark and less pronounced, your search for a true Jewish pluralism will only grow and strengthen. It's been a pleasure being with you, and thank you very much.
Just please remain seated for a moment. I just want to say that the purpose of this colloquium was obviously to provide both education and inspiration, but it was also for us as a movement to connect us in a more meaningful way to our Jewish past. And I think in a real way that it's done that. And I do want to say